my parents lived in Neutral Bay, which is a beautiful harbourside suburb of Sydney, and that was my schooling from when I was born until I was 12. And I'd come up here on the holidays, but when I flunked out of, well, I got expelled from high school, I came up here to my grandfather's place. And he was a fisherman and had his own house and a boat and lived by fishing. And that to me was an ideal situation, and that's what I wanted to do more than anything. But up here it's fishing on a trawler for prawns and mullet, and it's kind of quite difficult fishing. And you have to get the fish from wherever you are in this huge river to the shed, and in those days you had to get ice. It was a hell of a lot of work, and usually at the end of the week you'd cover costs and enough to buy food. Whereas in Sydney, down at the Spit or Balmoral, I would go down there to the marinas where they had $1 million yachts and beautiful marinas and beautiful facilities, but out the back would be 2 or 3 fishing boats, wooden fishing boats. And I would be about 11 and I would look at these fishing boats, and when they would come in the afternoons, they'd come in about 2 o'clock, and in the back would be these fish boxes full of these beautiful fish, like kingfish and mulloway and snapper, laid out in these beautiful boxes, still alive. And the 2 guys that had those boats, well, they seemed like old guys to me, but they were probably in their 30s, and 40s at the most. And the boats were immaculate, and their lines were in coils, like everything was just incredibly good. And they seemed to me to be like the most content people I'd ever seen in my life. And they were my heroes. Like, I just was too frightened to even speak to them. They were like gods. And after 2 or 3 years, I had some octopus. I was catching them. And one of them said, "What are you going to do with that octopus, kid?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know really." He said, "Well, we'll buy as many as you can catch because we use them for bait." So I started talking to them, asking them certain questions and learning how to tie knots and things. They were like the sort of, they were like Creeley and Charles Olsen of fishing. They were like Black Mountain fishermen of Sydney. Whereas up here it was like Philip Levine or something. It was industrial fishing. It was like working in a factory in Detroit. It was really harsh and you wanted to get away from it. And so as I started writing, well, when I realised I could write, when I published my first book, one of the first poems in the book was called Jerusalem Bay, which is here. And I used to come at the train lines up the top of that mountain there, and you get off at the train station and we'd walk down through the bush track, and I'd fish on that rock there, right there, when I was 12. And we'd stay there all night, me and my friend, and wait and for the hairtail to come, these long silver, beautiful, multicoloured, rainbow, chrome-coloured fish from the deep sea they come here in winter, and we would catch them from that rock over there. And they were like miracles that came out of the sea, and it was calm, the water was glassy. And this friend of mine brought me here. It wasn't connected to my family, it was a friend from Neutral Bay. He'd known about them because he'd been up here in a Halverson cruiser. I did that when I was 12, 14. So I knew this bay, but it was separate to the Hawkesbury of my grandfather. So I tried to write a poem about a big fish quite a few times, but it was always, Elizabeth Bishop's poem was just so shadowing over it, I couldn't do it. But finally I caught this fish, and I wrote the poem. It was specifically about that actual fish. The gathering light. Morning shines on the cowling of the Yamaha, locked onto the stern of the boat. Spears of light shoot away from the gunmetal grey enamel. Now I wait for God to show, instead of calling him a liar. I've just killed a mulloway. It's 85 pounds, 30 years old. The huge mauve-silver body trembled in the hull. Time whistles around us, an invisible flood tide that I let go while I take in what I have done. It wasn't a fight. I was drawn to this moment. The physical world drains away into a golden calm. The sun, a hole in the sky, a porthole. You can see turbulence out there, the old wheeling colours and their dark forces. But here, on the surface of the river, where I cradle the great fish in my arms and smell its pungent death, a peace I have never known before, a luminous absence of time, pain, sex, thought, of everything but light. If I wasn't a poet, I'd love this river because it's the best place to live, and it's well, it's just the quality of life is fantastic, and I love it physically, and I love fishing, and I love the birds. But to be a poet and live here as well, although a lot of my poems are drawn from the experiences I've had on the river, a lot of people tend to think that I'm writing poems about, you know, like the poet of the Hawkesbury sort of thing, and I'm probably that, but to me it's more a mythical river. It's more of a symbolic thing. It's a mystery, an unknowable mystery, as well as a physical river. It's a place and a metaphor. For every river, or any river, or the river Styx especially, I really see it, I think of it as the river Styx a lot, especially at night, when it's calm and there's stars, and I'm thinking about death, and you know, and I just think, well, there it is. Like, there's the other side, just there, and it's kind of comforting in a way. It's, and then I read all the literature, all the poems, and all the essays that have ever been written about the River Styx, and Ovid, and all the modern versions of it. That Eurydicean Orpheus myth is just so potent. I didn't really get myth until I spoke for weeks to Robert Duncan, and I was pretty confused, and I was pretty sort of hell bent on killing myself when I met him with alcohol and drugs. I was just hanging on by poetry, and he said to me, "You have to find your myth." And I said, "Oh, well, sure, okay." He said, "But it sounds easy. It sounds like a game, you know, find your myth." He said, "But when you find your myth and you look at that myth deeply and think about it, and it really is your myth, you'll really be looking at yourself squarely in the mirror, and it's not such fun." It took me a long time to get what he meant by that, you know, because all those mythical figures have got a lot of problems. Especially in the Greek myths. Thinking of Eurydice at midnight. My Siamese cat left a brown snake, its back broken, on my desk. The underground throbs outside my window. The black highway of the river is crinkled by a light westerly blowing down. I want to give praise to the coming winter, but problems of belief flare and buckle under the lumpy syntax. The unelected presidents on the radio again, laying waste to the world. Faith, that old lie. I drag up impossible meanings and double divisions of love and betrayal, light and dark. Where on earth am I after all these years? A possum eats crusts on the veranda, standing up on its hind legs. My weakness can't be measured. My head contains thousands of images, slimy mackerel splashing about in the murk. My failures slip through my fingers, pointed at the best night of my life, this one. A cold mist falls, my head floats in a stream of thinking. Eurydice, did I fumble? Maybe I was meant to be the moon's reflection and sing darkness like the nightjar. Why wouldn't I infest this place where the sun shines on the settlers and their heirs, and these heirlooms I weave from their blonde silk? Robert Duncan came to Australia in 1978, and I was living in Sydney at the time. He did a tour of Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and stayed at my house in Lane Cove for a whole week, and we had well, it was one of the life-changing periods of my life, talking to Robert Duncan. And I think he was late 50s, and I brought him up to meet my grandfather. He liked the poems about my grandfather. I thought he'd like the poems that I'd copied from his poems, but he didn't talk about them much. I was so influenced by him, I was almost writing like him. Not that you can write like Robert Duncan, but there are certain poets you can't be influenced by, like Hopkins and Dylan Thomas and Duncan especially. Olsen's another one. So I brought him up here to meet my grandfather. I took him in a little rowing boat, a little old-fashioned clinker rowing boat that was beautifully made, that my grandfather had, and we rowed out over there, and he wanted to see a kangaroo, and I said, well, you know, it's like, you've got to come in the morning, at dawn. And so this is a poem I wrote maybe 20 years after that experience, that real experience. And I've changed it from daytime to nighttime in the poem, because Duncan was every night looking at the stars. He just wanted to see the southern heavens. Blackwater. I took Robert Duncan in my grandfather's skiff, rowing across Mooney Creek. Words hummed around our heads. The trees are speaking on the far shore. We'll never get there in time. The pages of books swim upstream. We study words glowing on them. The time will come and you will turn. The present a breeze that passes, sweeps up, carrying the odour the mower has created as he moves through the rushes, looking for glowworms. Words, little warm animals of air. Words growing and teeming over the mudflats. This river has no bends. This river is not an actual river yet. This water has burnt its right of way into the sandstone. Great sheets of it slide by on either side, parting and taking the flotsam. The mower creates, for she my mind hath so displaced that I shall never find my home. Marvell was calling from the mangroves. Our souls, crows gliding down to eat the words. Time created endless bends. The river was never the same. That night Duncan gathered the southern stars into his being, the black water plopping with fat mullet. Creeley was fantastic. He was the opposite to Duncan. As soon as he got off the plane, he said, "What happened when Duncan was here? What happened when Duncan..." They were talking. I learnt so much just by him. He was sitting on my bed reading it out, and then he'd stand up and pace up and down, and it was just riveting. Absolutely. And that was by 4 o'clock in the morning. He was and then I started reading him poems that I liked, and we kept going until dawn. And he said, "There's the crack of dawn. Here comes the sun," and he started singing John Lennon, "Here comes the sun." And then we were playing Jimmy Buffett songs, wasting away in Margaritaville. It was amazing. And then I showed him my poems by 8 o'clock. I showed him my manuscript. He's reading it with his one eye staring at it, and his hair falling down over his forehead. He looked like a crow, like a raven. He was amazing. He's so fierce. And by this stage, we'd had 2 bottles of Jack Daniels, and he read, but he didn't get drunk. You know, his mind was still as agile. He read through the poems and he said, "How long did it take you to write this?" I said, 2 or 3 years. He said, and he just threw the whole manuscript and went, whew, like a pack of cards across the room. He said, "You're just imitating Robert Duncan. Just completely imitating. What are you doing this for?" I said, well, he's one of my influences. He's one of my, masters. And he said, "Last night you told me all these stories about your grandfather and fishing and the mud flats, and the air was full of poetry. It was marvellous. And why don't you write that?" I said, "That's just stuff that happened to me in my life." He said, "Well, there you go." And so I got rid of all the adjectives when he left, and I'll read you one of the poems that I wrote after before Creeley. I was writing these very ornate poems that sort of crossed between John Donne, Charles Olson and Robert Duncan. And then when Creeley left, I thought, oh, well, I'll write some poems like Creeley I couldn't. So I thought, well, I'll do what he told me and write down those stories. And one of the stories, which I thought was a story, I just told him about when he said, "What happened when your grandfather died?" I said, "Well, my grandmother died before that. She was Irish." And he said, and I told him the story about my Irish grandmother, and this is it. And I wrote it down here, just like I told him. My granny. When my granny was dying, I'd go into her bedroom and look at her. She'd tell me to get out of it, to leave this foul river. It will wear you out too. She was very sick, and her red curly hair was matted and smelt of gin. Sometimes I sat there all day listening to the races and put bets on for her at the shop. I sat there the afternoon she died and heard her say her last words. I sat there not telling, maybe 3 hours, beside the first dead person I'd seen. I tried to drink some of her gin. It made me throw up on the bed. Then I left her. She said, "The prawns will eat you when you die on the Hawkesbury River." Talking of Robert Duncan, the southern skua. Skuas are these birds, seabirds. They're like hawks. They're like kind of swamp harriers of the oceans. They're crossed between a falcon and a albatross. You can imagine that. They've got all the instinct of a falcon, and they're quite big. The southern skua. The skua flew into our heads in 1968, a new kind of poetry, a scavenging predator, frequently attacking humans, flying through the streets of seaside towns, foraging for seagulls. This bird has few predators. One was found in Tasmania, its beak embedded in the skull of a spotted quoll, dragged into a clearing by devils. They form clubs and proclaim their territory by various displays and loud, aggressive calls. They are agile metaphysicians, sweeping along lines of projective verse, echoing each other's songs. Although the skua breeds on Black Mountain, it is migratory and dispersive. Its call a series of low quacks and thin whinnying squeals. They are omnivorous and critical creatures. Animal liberationists never mention the habits of a skua. If you read Skua poetry, beware. One could fly out from the page and change the expression on your face. The stone curlew. I am writing this inside the head of a bush stone curlew. We have been travelling for days, moving over the earth, flying when necessary. I am not the bird itself, only its passenger, looking through its eyes. The world rocks slightly as we move over the stubble grass of the dunes. At night, shooting stars draw lines across the velvet dark as I hang in a sling of light between the bird's nocturnal eyes. The heavens make sense. Seeing this way makes me want to believe that words have meanings, that Australia is no longer a wound in the side of the earth. I think of the white settlers who compared the curlew's song to the cries of women being strangled. And remember the poets who wrote anthropomorphically as I sing softly from the jelly of the stone curlew's brain. Juno and Eurydice. When Juno met A.D. Hope, our great poet, who was a classic scholar, and he let me use his room in the A.D. Hope building in the ANU University, and while I was there as a poet in residence, he let me use his room, and he went home. And I said, "This is my wife Juno," and he looked at Juno and he looked at me, he said, "You're a poet married to Juno, you're in a lot of trouble." He's thinking of the mythological Juno. He was great. Juno and Eurydice. Our boat hits the warm air, sitting in Mooney Creek, as the first light of dawn begins to trace dark mountains. We come in from the night, leaving behind our particular hells. Back up the creek, the mist rises in great white banks. Ahead of us, our house on the point. Each year we make it through, and time brings images and poems to map the journey. Each year we find this place holding us back from going, the river country taking us in. We claim it just by being here, on the brink of darkness. A crimson rosella draws a line of colour across the white bay. We are drenched in light, and the rich smell of the river rising from the mangroves. A welcome swallow skims the fresh water in our pool. I couldn't live without you now, though in dreams I've betrayed Eurydice. Death has become a part of what the rivers taught me. This world is created for us above ground, where even lyrebirds walk slowly through your garden, holding their lyres high. We move in and out of the myth, becoming figures from them. Maybe the longer we live here, the less they matter, as we tell ourselves stories that were here before myth.